The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Marcus Thompson adjusted his red tunic for the final time. Today marked his first day as a member of the Queen's Guard, a dream he had carried since childhood. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he stood at attention, his polished boots gleaming against the cobblestones. Marcus had worked tirelessly to reach this moment. Growing up in Birmingham, he had watched the changing of the guard ceremony on television countless times, mesmerized by the precision and dignity of the soldiers. His grandmother often told him stories of her father, who had served in the British Army during World War II, instilling in him a deep respect for military service and tradition. After years of rigorous training, physical conditioning, and mental preparation, Marcus had finally earned his place among the elite guards who protected the royal family. His family had traveled from Birmingham the previous evening to witness this historic moment. He would be one of the first black soldiers to serve in this prestigious position in recent decades. As Marcus took his position outside the palace gates, tourists began gathering for the morning ceremony. Children pressed their faces against the iron railings. Cameras clicked rapidly and tour guides spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the centuries-old traditions they were witnessing. The weight of his bearskin hat felt familiar now after months of training, and the red tunic bore the proud insignia of his regiment. Marcus maintained the required stoic expression, his eyes fixed straight ahead, embodying the unwavering discipline that the Queen's Guard represented. Among the gathering crowd, a man in his 60s approached the barriers. Colonel James Whitfield, recently retired from the military, carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His gray mustache was perfectly trimmed and his expensive suit suggested wealth and status. Whitfield had served for over 30 years in various military positions, though his career had been marked more by his connections than his achievements. Whitfield's face hardened as his gaze fell upon Marcus. The sight of a black soldier in the iconic red uniform triggered something unpleasant within him. He had grown up in a different era, surrounded by people who shared his narrow worldview, and despite the changing times, his attitudes remained stubbornly fixed in the past. The crowd around Whitfield was diverse, representing the modern face of Britain, families from different backgrounds, tourists from around the world, and locals who took pride in their country's evolving traditions. Children of various ethnicities pointed excitedly at the guards, their innocent eyes seeing only the majesty and honor of the uniform, not the color of the skin beneath it. As the minutes passed, Whitfield's agitation grew. He began muttering under his breath, his comments growing louder and more pointed. Other visitors noticed his behavior, some moving away uncomfortably, while others shot disapproving glances in his direction. Marcus, trained to ignore distractions and maintain his post regardless of external circumstances, continued his duty with perfect composure. He had faced prejudice before during his military career, and understood that his presence in this role was significant beyond his personal achievement. He represented progress, hope, and the evolving nature of British society. The irony was not lost on Marcus that he stood protecting the very institution that had once excluded people who looked like him. But he also understood that change came through participation, through proving oneself worthy through actions rather than words. His presence here was a statement not just for himself, but for every young person of color who might dream of serving their country in the highest traditions. As the morning progressed, more visitors arrived and the area became busier. Tour buses discharged groups of excited tourists. School children on educational trips clutched their notebooks and cameras, and local residents passed by on their way to work, many pausing to acknowledge the guards with respectful nods. Whitfield positioned himself closer to the barriers, his voice carrying more clearly now. His words were carefully chosen to avoid outright confrontation, but their meaning was unmistakable to those who heard them. He questioned aloud whether traditions were being properly maintained, whether standards had been lowered, and whether certain appointments were made for the right reasons. The tension in the air was palpable. Some visitors began to realize that something unpleasant was developing, though Marcus remained perfectly still, his training and professionalism preventing any visible reaction to the provocation. This moment represented more than just one man's prejudice encountering one soldier's dignity. It was a collision between old attitudes and new realities, between those who clung to exclusionary traditions and those who believed that honor and service transcended racial boundaries. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only Marcus's resolve but also the values that modern Britain claimed to embrace. In the heart of London, outside one of the most recognizable buildings in the world, a quiet drama was about to unfold that would reveal the character of all involved. As the clock tower chimed the hour, marking the approach of the formal ceremony, the crowd grew larger and more attentive. What many expected to be a routine display of British pageantry was about to become something far more significant, a moment that would be remembered long after the tourists had returned home and the photographs had faded. Marcus stood ready, his commitment unwavering, prepared to face whatever challenge awaited while upholding the honor and dignity of his position. The morning was still young, but already the seeds of an important confrontation had been planted in the ancient stones of the palace courtyard. Colonel Whitfield's patience finally snapped as he watched Marcus maintain his perfect stance. The sight of what he considered an affront to tradition gnawed at him until he could no longer contain his disapproval. Moving closer to the barrier, he raised his voice just enough to be heard clearly by those around him. "This is what our proud traditions have come to," Whitfield announced to no one in particular, though his words were clearly directed at Marcus. Standards have clearly been lowered to accommodate political correctness rather than maintaining proper qualifications. Several tourists turned toward Whitfield, surprised by his hostile tone. A family from Japan looked confused, not understanding the undercurrent of racism in his words but sensing the negativity. An elderly British couple exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing exactly what Whitfield was implying. Marcus heard every word but remained motionless. His training had prepared him for this moment, though experiencing it firsthand was more challenging than any simulation. He focused on his breathing, maintaining the controlled rhythm that helped him stay centered during difficult situations. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that dignity in the face of ignorance was the strongest response. Emboldened by the lack of any visible reaction from Marcus, Whitfield continued his verbal assault. "I served this country for 30 years, he declared loudly. "I know what real soldiers look like, and I know what standards used to mean something." A young mother with 2 small children moved away from Whitfield, pulling her kids closer as she sensed the ugliness of his comments. The children, who had been excitedly pointing at the colorful guards, now seemed confused by the angry man's raised voice. "Some people don't belong in certain positions," Whitfield pressed on, his voice growing more confident as he noticed a few people listening. "There are traditional roles that require traditional qualities. This isn't about being fair, it's about maintaining excellence." An American tourist named David Chen, who had been photographing the ceremony with his teenage daughter, lowered his camera and stared at Whitfield in disbelief. Having served in the U.S. military himself, David recognized both the professionalism of the Guard and the unprovoked nature of Whitfield's attack. Marcus continued his silent vigil, but inside memories flooded his mind. He remembered his first day at military academy, when instructors had pushed him harder than others, questioning whether he had the mental toughness required. He recalled late nights studying military history, learning about the brave soldiers of all backgrounds who had served Britain with honor throughout the centuries. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably. What had started as a pleasant morning of sightseeing was becoming something much more unpleasant. Some visitors moved to different positions around the palace, while others remained out of curiosity or concern for how the situation would develop. Whitfield, misinterpreting the crowd's attention as support, became even more bold. "I've seen real guards," he continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Men who earned their positions through merit, not through quotas or diversity programs. This is what happens when politics interferes with military tradition." A Scottish tourist named Ian MacLeod, visiting London with his wife, stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," he said firmly to Whitfield, "but that young man is serving his country with honor. Perhaps you should show some respect for his service." Whitfield turned toward Ian with a condescending smile. "Respect is earned, not given because someone puts on a uniform. I know quality when I see it, and I know when standards have been compromised." The tension escalated as more people became aware of the confrontation. A group of university students from London began recording the incident on their phones, recognizing the historical significance of what they were witnessing. Social media had made such moments instantly shareable, and they understood that this encounter represented larger issues facing British society. Marcus felt the weight of representation on his shoulders. He knew that his response to this challenge would be remembered and possibly shared widely. Every black child who might see this moment, every person who questioned whether they belonged in prestigious positions, would be watching how he handled this test of his character and training. The protocol for Queen's Guard required absolute stillness and silence, except in cases of genuine security threats. Whitfield's words, though painful and insulting, did not constitute a physical danger that would justify breaking protocol. Marcus had to find a way to respond that honored both his training and his dignity. Around the courtyard, other guards remained at their posts, but several had noticed the disturbance. The brotherhood among the guards was strong, regardless of background, and Marcus knew his colleagues supported him even if they couldn't openly intervene. A young black girl, perhaps 8 years old, tugged on her father's coat sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is that man being mean to the soldier?" Her father, Dr. Michael Johnson, a physician from Manchester, knelt down to comfort his daughter while struggling to find age-appropriate words to explain the prejudice they were witnessing. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the scene. Tour guides began redirecting their groups away from the immediate area, sensing that the situation might escalate further. However, many individual visitors remained, drawn by a mixture of concern, curiosity, and the sense that they were witnessing an important moment. Whitfield's confidence grew with each passing minute of Marcus's silence. In his mind, the lack of response confirmed his belief that the young guard was unprepared for the responsibilities of his position. He failed to recognize that Marcus's composure actually demonstrated exactly the kind of professional discipline that the Queen's Guard required. The stage was set for a response that would surprise everyone present. Marcus had endured the verbal assault with remarkable restraint, but those who knew military tradition understood that there were ways to respond that honored both duty and dignity. The question was no longer whether Marcus would respond, but how he would choose to demonstrate the true meaning of service and excellence. The moment arrived when Marcus decided he could not let Whitfield's attacks continue unchallenged. However, his response would not involve breaking protocol or abandoning his post. Instead, he would demonstrate the true meaning of military excellence in a way that Whitfield clearly did not understand. Without moving his head or shifting his stance, Marcus began to speak. His voice was clear, measured, and carried the authority of someone who had earned his position through genuine merit. The words he chose would honor both his training and his heritage. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the morning air with crisp precision, "I understand your concerns about maintaining military standards. As someone who has served, you surely recognize the importance of earning one's position through demonstrated competence, rather than assumptions about capability." The crowd immediately fell silent. Even children stopped chattering as they sensed something important was happening. Whitfield's face showed surprise. He had clearly expected either silence or an emotional outburst. "Not this composed, articulate response," Marcus continued, still maintaining his rigid posture and forward gaze. "My selection for the Queen's Guard followed the same rigorous process applied to every candidate. Physical fitness assessments, psychological evaluations, background investigations, and extensive training protocols. The standards were not lowered. They were met and exceeded." Several people in the crowd pulled out their phones, realizing they were witnessing something remarkable. A young journalism student named Sarah Mitchell positioned herself where she could capture both Marcus speaking and Whitfield's reaction. Understanding that this moment represented an important intersection of tradition and progress. "The regiment I represent has a distinguished history spanning centuries," Marcus proceeded, his knowledge of military history evident in every word. "From Waterloo to the Somme, from Normandy to Afghanistan, soldiers of various backgrounds have served with honor under these colors. Excellence has never been defined by appearance but by character, courage, and commitment to duty." Whitfield's confidence began to waver as he realized that Marcus was demonstrating exactly the kind of military bearing and knowledge that he claimed to value. The young guard's response was not defensive or angry, but rather educational and dignified, the mark of someone truly comfortable with his qualifications and position. Dr. Michael Johnson, still comforting his young daughter, found himself moved by Marcus's words. Here was a teachable moment about how to face prejudice with grace and strength. His daughter listened intently, absorbing lessons about dignity and response that would stay with her for years to come. Marcus shifted slightly, executing a perfect military movement that brought him to a position where he could address Whitfield more directly, while remaining within protocol. The precision of the movement itself was a demonstration of his training and competence. "You mentioned earning respect through service," Marcus continued, his voice steady and strong. "My service began in Afghanistan, where I completed 2 tours of duty with the Parachute Regiment. I was awarded the Military Cross for actions during a convoy ambush outside Helmand Province, where my unit extracted wounded civilians under enemy fire." The crowd stirred as the weight of Marcus's words settled over them. Whitfield's face had gone pale, clearly not expecting to discover that the young guard he was attacking was actually a decorated combat veteran with a distinguished service record. "I mention this not to boast," Marcus added quickly, "but to illustrate that merit comes in many forms, and those who truly understand military service recognize it regardless of its packaging. The Queen's Guard represents the very best of British military tradition, and I am honored to uphold that standard." An elderly veteran in the crowd, recognizing the significance of the military cross that Marcus had mentioned, removed his cap in a gesture of respect. The military cross was one of Britain's highest decorations for valor, awarded only for exceptional bravery in combat situations. Ian MacLeod, the Scottish tourist who had earlier defended Marcus, stepped closer to Whitfield. "Perhaps you owe this young man an apology," he said firmly. "He's clearly proven his worth through service to our country in ways that matter." But Marcus wasn't finished. Having established his credentials, he now addressed the broader implications of Whitfield's assumptions with the wisdom of someone who had faced such prejudice before and emerged stronger. "The uniform I wear represents an institution that evolves while maintaining its core values," Marcus said, his voice taking on an almost instructional tone. "Excellence, honor, and service to Crown and country remain unchanged. What has changed, thankfully, is our understanding that these qualities exist in people of all backgrounds." A group of tourists from various countries watched in amazement as this young soldier transformed what could have been an ugly confrontation into a powerful lesson about dignity, merit, and the true meaning of military service. This was not the ceremonial pageantry they had come to see, but something far more meaningful. Marcus paused briefly, allowing his words to settle before delivering what would prove to be the most impactful part of his response. The crowd sensed that something important was building, and even those who had been trying to leave stopped to hear what the young guard would say next. "Sir, your concern for maintaining standards is noted and shared," Marcus said, his tone remaining respectful despite the provocation he had endured. "However, true leadership recognizes excellence wherever it emerges and creates opportunities for it to flourish. The British military's greatest strength has always been its ability to identify and develop talent based on character rather than appearance." The morning sun had climbed higher, illuminating the scene with a clarity that seemed to match the transparency of Marcus's words. What had begun as an attempt to diminish his presence had instead created an opportunity for him to demonstrate exactly the qualities that made him worthy of his position. Whitfield stood speechless, realizing that his assumptions had not only been wrong, but had exposed his own limitations rather than revealing any weakness in the young guard he had attempted to challenge. The impact of Marcus's words rippled through the gathered crowd like stones thrown into still water. Whitfield stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of shock, embarrassment, and growing realization that his attack had not only failed, but had exposed his own prejudices to a very public audience. David Chen, the American tourist, approached his teenage daughter and whispered, "Emma, you're witnessing something important here. Remember this moment. This is how you respond to ignorance with intelligence and grace." Emma nodded solemnly, her phone still recording as she understood that she was documenting a moment that would likely be shared far beyond this courtyard. She had grown up in a diverse community where such prejudice seemed outdated, but seeing it confronted so eloquently gave her hope for how society could progress. Marcus wasn't finished with his masterful response. Having established his credentials and addressed Whitfield's assumptions about standards, he now moved to what would prove to be the most powerful element of his reply. a demonstration of the very leadership qualities that Whitfield had claimed were missing. "Colonel Whitfield," Marcus said, using the man's rank which he had gleaned from Whitfield's earlier boasting about his service record, "your 30 years of service deserve recognition, regardless of our current disagreement. Military service, whether in my generation or yours, requires sacrifice and dedication." The crowd stirred with surprise at this gesture of respect. Even after being subjected to thinly veiled racism and public humiliation, Marcus was choosing to acknowledge Whitfield's service rather than attacking him personally. This display of maturity and leadership left many observers deeply moved. Whitfield's expression shifted again, this time to confusion. He had expected either silence or anger, but this gracious acknowledgement of his service while simultaneously dismantling his arguments was completely unexpected. It demonstrated a level of emotional intelligence and tactical thinking that he clearly hadn't anticipated. However, Marcus continued, his voice maintaining its steady professional tone, "I would respectfully suggest that true military leadership involves recognizing potential in others and supporting their development, regardless of their background. The greatest officers I served under in Afghanistan were those who judged their soldiers by their actions and character." A woman in the crowd, Mrs. Elizabeth Harper, a retired teacher in her 70s, found herself fighting back tears. She had lived through decades of social change in Britain and recognized that she was witnessing a pivotal moment in how the country addressed its complex history. With race and tradition, Marcus executed another precise military movement, this time turning slightly to address the broader crowd while still maintaining his professional bearing. His next words would address not just Whitfield, but everyone present, turning the confrontation into a teaching moment about the values that truly mattered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "you're witnessing one of Britain's greatest traditions, the peaceful exchange of ideas, and the opportunity for people to demonstrate their worth through their actions rather than their appearance." The young journalism student Sarah Mitchell recognized that she was capturing what would likely become a viral moment. This wasn't just about one guard defending himself. It was about the evolution of British society and institutions in real time. "The Queen's Guard has always represented the best of British values," Marcus continued, "including our growing understanding that excellence comes from character, training, and dedication to duty. Today's exchange demonstrates that these institutions can evolve while maintaining their core integrity." Ian MacLeod, the Scottish tourist who had earlier spoken up for Marcus, found himself impressed not just by the young guard's knowledge and composure, but by his ability to transform a negative situation into something positive and educational. This was leadership in action. Marcus then did something that surprised everyone, including Whitfield. He offered what amounted to an olive branch, an opportunity for redemption rather than further humiliation. "Colonel Whitfield, if you're genuinely interested in understanding how modern military selection processes work, I'd be happy to provide you with information about current training standards and requirements. You might find that they're actually more rigorous than in previous eras, incorporating lessons learned from recent conflicts." This gesture of professional courtesy, offered after enduring public insult, demonstrated exactly the kind of grace under pressure that military leadership required. Several veterans in the crowd recognized this quality immediately and exchanged knowing looks. Dr. Johnson knelt down again beside his 8-year-old daughter, who had been listening intently to the exchange. "What do you think about how that soldier handled the mean man?" he asked her quietly. "He was nice even when the man was mean," she replied with the clarity that children often brought to complex situations. "And he's really brave if he was a soldier in a war." The wisdom in her simple observation captured what many adults in the crowd were thinking. Marcus had demonstrated that true strength involved not just physical courage in combat, but the moral courage to respond to prejudice with dignity and education rather than anger. Whitfield remained silent, clearly struggling with how to respond. His initial assumptions had been thoroughly dismantled. His own service record had been respectfully acknowledged despite his behavior, and he had been offered a gracious path toward understanding rather than continued conflict. The crowd began to sense that this extraordinary encounter was reaching its conclusion. What had started as an ugly display of prejudice had been transformed by Marcus's response into something approaching a masterclass in leadership, dignity, and the proper way to handle conflict. But Marcus had one final element to add to his response, something that would demonstrate not just his own character, but his understanding of the broader significance of the moment they had all shared. Marcus prepared to deliver the final element of his response, understanding that this moment would be remembered long after the crowd dispersed. He had successfully defended his position and credentials, but now he wanted to ensure that everyone present understood the larger meaning of what they had witnessed. "Before we conclude this discussion," Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone that suggested both finality and invitation, "I'd like to share something that my grandmother told me before I first enlisted. She said that every generation has the opportunity to make their country a little better than they found it, not by tearing down tradition, but by ensuring that tradition includes everyone worthy of participating." The crowd leaned in slightly, sensing that these final words would be significant. Even Whitfield, despite his obvious discomfort, found himself listening intently to what the young guard would say next. "The Queen's Guard has protected this institution for centuries," Marcus continued, "and we will continue to do so with the same dedication and professionalism that has always defined this role. What has changed is that young people of all backgrounds can now aspire to serve in positions that were once closed to them. Not because standards have been lowered, but because we finally recognize that talent and character exist in every community." Mrs. Harper, the retired teacher, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She had taught children of all backgrounds for over 40 years, and had always believed that potential existed everywhere, if given the opportunity to develop. Seeing Marcus articulate this principle so eloquently, while maintaining his professional duties, filled her with hope for the future. Marcus shifted his attention specifically to the children in the crowd, recognizing that they would carry the memory of this moment into their own futures. "To the young people here today," he said, his voice warm but still maintaining its military bearing, "remember that your dreams are valid regardless of what others might say. If you're willing to work hard, serve with honor, and maintain the highest standards, there is a place for you in any tradition worth preserving." Emma Chen, the American teenager who had been recording the encounter, felt a chill run down her spine. She realized she was documenting something that would inspire people far beyond this moment, possibly for years to come. Dr. Johnson's young daughter tugged on her father's sleeve again. "Daddy, I want to be a soldier like him when I grow up," she whispered. Her father smiled, understanding that Marcus had just planted a seed of possibility in his daughter's mind that might grow into something beautiful. Marcus then did something unexpected. He acknowledged the crowd's role in what had just transpired, recognizing that their presence and reactions had been part of the story. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've also played an important role today," he said, scanning the faces around him. "Some of you spoke up for fairness, others listened with open minds, and all of you witnessed that difficult conversations can be handled with respect and dignity when people choose to engage thoughtfully." Ian McLeod felt proud that he had spoken up earlier, but also impressed by how Marcus had taken a situation that could have become ugly and transformed it into something positive and educational. This was the kind of leadership that gave him hope for younger generations. Sarah Mitchell, the journalism student, realized that her recording had captured not just a confrontation, but a masterclass in conflict resolution and public communication. This would become part of her portfolio, but more importantly, it would influence how she approached difficult stories in her future career. Marcus made one final gesture that would seal his reputation as someone who understood both tradition and progress. He executed a perfect military salute, not to any individual, but to the crowd as a whole, a gesture of respect for their attention and their role as witnesses to an important moment. The Queen's Guard serves not just the royal family, but the values and aspirations of the British people, Marcus said as he held the salute. "Today we've demonstrated that those values include respect, dignity, and the understanding that excellence comes in many forms." As Marcus completed his salute and returned to his standard position, the crowd began to applaud spontaneously. It started with Dr. Johnson and his daughter, spread to Ian McLeod and his wife, and soon included nearly everyone present. Even some tourists who hadn't fully understood the English conversation recognized that they had witnessed something remarkable. Whitfield stood isolated in the middle of this appreciation, fully aware that his attempt to diminish Marcus had instead highlighted the young guard's exceptional character and qualifications. The contrast between his own behavior and Marcus's response was stark and undeniable. The sound of approaching footsteps indicated that other guards were arriving for the next shift change, and the formal ceremony that tourists had come to see was about to begin. But everyone present knew that they had already witnessed something far more memorable than the usual pageantry. As the crowd began to reorganize for the official ceremony, people continued to look toward Marcus with newfound respect and admiration. His dignified response to provocation had not only silenced his critic, but had elevated the meaning of the tradition he represented. The morning sun was now fully up, casting everything in clear, bright light, a fitting metaphor for how Marcus's response had brought clarity to a situation that could have remained murky and unpleasant. What would happen next would determine whether this moment became simply a memorable encounter or something with lasting impact beyond the palace walls. As the formal changing of the guard ceremony began, the crowd's attention shifted to the choreographed precision of the traditional ritual. However, the impact of the morning's events continued to resonate among those who had witnessed Marcus's remarkable response to Colonel Whitfield's challenge. Sarah Mitchell, the journalism student, immediately began uploading her video to social media platforms with carefully chosen captions that emphasized the dignity and professionalism she had witnessed. Within hours, the footage began spreading across the internet, with viewers around the world sharing their admiration for Marcus's composed and articulate response to prejudice. The video reached Dr. Johnson's social media feed by evening, where he shared it with the caption, "This is the kind of role model I want my daughter to see. Character, dignity, and excellence in the face of ignorance." His post was shared hundreds of times by parents who recognized the educational value of Marcus's example. Emma Chen's footage, posted from her father's account, reached their community back in California, where it was picked up by local news stations impressed by the young guard's articulate defense of merit-based advancement. The story began appearing on international news programs as an example of how traditional institutions could evolve while maintaining their core values. Meanwhile, Whitfield had quietly disappeared from the scene during the ceremony, his planned day of sightseeing ruined by the realization that his assumptions had been publicly and thoroughly dismantled. The encounter would force him to confront his own prejudices in ways he had previously avoided. Within 48 hours, Marcus's response had become a viral sensation, not because it was dramatic or confrontational, but because it demonstrated exactly the qualities that people hope to see in public servants and military personnel: intelligence, composure, respect for others, and the ability to transform negative situations into positive outcomes. The Palace Communications Office, initially concerned about the attention, soon realized that the incident had actually enhanced the reputation of the Queen's Guard. Marcus had shown that the institution attracted people of exceptional character who could uphold its traditions while representing modern British values. Mrs. Harper, the retired teacher, sent the video to her former colleagues still working in education, noting that it provided a perfect example of how to respond to bullying and prejudice with dignity, rather than aggression. Schools across the country began using the footage in character education programs. A week later, Marcus received a letter from a 10-year-old boy in Manchester who had seen the video. "Dear soldier," it read in careful handwriting, "My mom showed me the video of you talking to the mean man. I want to be brave like you when I grow up. Can I be a Queen's Guard too, even though I look different from the old pictures?" The letter was signed, "Future Soldier Jamie." Marcus took time to write a personal response, encouraging Jamie to work hard in school and stay physically fit, explaining that the Queen's Guard welcomed anyone willing to meet the high standards required for service. He enclosed information about youth programs that could help Jamie begin preparing for a potential military career. The incident had ripple effects throughout the military community as well. Senior officers began discussing how Marcus's response could be used as a training example for handling difficult public situations. His ability to maintain protocol while effectively communicating had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership potential that the military sought to develop. Colonel Patricia Williams, Marcus's commanding officer requested a meeting to discuss the incident. Rather than expressing concern about the public attention, she commended Marcus for his professionalism and suggested that he consider applying for positions that would utilize his obvious communication skills and ability to represent the military to civilian audiences. Ian MacLeod, back home in Scotland, found himself telling the story repeatedly to friends and family, emphasizing how impressed he had been not just by Marcus's credentials, but by his gracious response to someone who had disrespected him. The story became part of MacLeod's repertoire of examples about the importance of standing up for others. 3 months later, Marcus was selected to participate in a recruitment video for the Queen's Guard, where he spoke about the honor of serving and the importance of maintaining high standards while welcoming qualified candidates from all backgrounds. The video was viewed by thousands of young people considering military careers. Dr. Johnson's daughter, true to her word, began asking for books about military history and frequently drew pictures of soldiers in red uniforms. Her father understood that Marcus's example had planted seeds that might influence her future choices, demonstrating the lasting impact that moments of grace under pressure could have on young minds. The journalism department at Sarah Mitchell's University used her footage as part of a case study about citizen journalism and the responsibility that comes with documenting important social moments. Her professors emphasized how her decision to record and share the incident had helped preserve an important example of dignified leadership. A year later, Marcus was promoted to sergeant and assigned additional responsibilities that included training new recruits and representing the Guard at public events. His reputation for professionalism and his ability to articulate the values of military service made him a natural choice for these expanded duties. The bench where Whitfield had stood during the confrontation became, for some visitors, an informal reminder of the importance of examining one's assumptions about others. Tour guides occasionally mentioned the incident as an example of how public spaces could become venues for important conversations about fairness and respect. Emma Chen, now a college freshman, kept the video in her personal collection and occasionally watched it when facing challenges in her own life. Marcus's example of responding to hostility with education and grace had become one of her touchstones for handling difficult interpersonal situations. The most lasting impact, however, was on the young people who saw the video and understood that excellence, character, and the opportunity to serve could not be determined by appearance or background. Marcus had demonstrated that traditions were strengthened, not weakened, when they embraced worthy participants regardless of their origins. In the end, what Colonel Whitfield had intended as a dismissal of Marcus's worthiness had become instead a platform for demonstrating exactly the qualities that made him exemplary. The morning's encounter at Buckingham Palace had proved that dignity, preparation, and grace under pressure were indeed the marks of true excellence, qualities that had nothing to do with race and everything to do with character.